I'm very, very pleased to introduce Rich Lopez to you. Thanks so much, and have a great presentation.
Thank you. I really appreciate you all coming out tonight, beginning of Labor Day weekend. This is revealing of you being interested in the brain, or just topics that you wouldn't otherwise hear about. And this is a privilege. It's honestly a privilege to come and share my passion for neuroscience, my passion for how neuroscience can impact us and how we think about ourselves, our behaviors, and our daily lives. And I really have to thank Amanda for encouraging me to do this, and for Chris and her help here at the co-op. And I've set up some talking points, but this should be incredibly organic and flexible in terms of where we go with what we talk about. But I want to start with a little bit of a preface in which I want to take a step back and think about the scientific enterprise, because science is messy. It is not as clean cut as you might think it is sometimes, or how the media portrays it. The answers are not always clear. We want clear answers, but it's not always easy. And I actually want to share some poetry with you, and I bet you didn't think you're going to hear some poetry tonight. So this is T.S. Eliot, and this is from his work, The Four Quartets, and specifically it's from the poem East Coker. And he's talking about his struggles with his own subjective experience of trying to articulate his thoughts in his poetry, but I think it even gives us a window into how messy and chaotic and confusing our psychological lives are. So I'm just going to recite this, if you don't mind indulging me. It's one of my favorite poems. So this is T.S. Eliot, East Coker, stanza 5. So here I am in the middle way, having had 20 years largely wasted, the years of the two wars, trying to learn to use words, and every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure. Because one has only learnt to get the better of words, because one has only learned to get the better of words for the thing one no longer has to say, or the way in which one is no longer disposed to say it. And so each venture is a new beginning, a raid on the inarticulate, with shabby equipment always deteriorating, in the general mess of imprecision of feeling, undisciplined squads of emotion. And what there is to conquer by strength and submission has already been discovered once or twice or several times by men whom one cannot hope to emulate, but there is no competition. There is only the fight to recover what has been lost and found and lost again and again, and now under conditions that seem unpropitious, but perhaps neither gain nor loss. For us, there's only the trying. The rest is not our business. So I take this to heart even in my scientific endeavors, where we're trying to get at some pretty complicated phenomena of our mental lives. And another problematic aspect in psychology and neuroscience is it is the only discipline in which the object of study and the means by which we study it are one and the same. And that's like a huge philosophical conundrum that we don't have time to go into tonight. But keep that in mind as we talk about the brain together. So tonight I'm going to generally go over 3 points, and I should say interrupt me, raise your hand if you have a question. Even though I kind of have a flow here, we can take it any which way we want, and I want it to be incredibly informal and conversational. So I don't want this to be lecture-based. It'll be lecture-y at points, but not super lecture-based. So I want to start tonight with just getting us all on the same page about this organ. It's not this big, as you well know. It's about this big, and it's amazing because it's quite small, but it is the seat of our experiences, of our mental lives, of how we love, of how we relate to other people, and it's all instantiated in this little chunk of matter. And that's amazing. I mean, again, that could be another conversation for another night. How does that happen? How do our rich experiences arise from this piece of matter? So to get us on the same page, I want to talk a little bit about our reward system in our brain and what kind of neural equipment we have inherited related to motivation and reward. So you can imagine our ancestors lived in a very different environment than we do today, okay? Where survival was not a guarantee. I mean, our survival in so many ways is easier than it was thousands of years ago. So how did our brains adapt so that our ancestors could survive and seek out things in the environment that would be helpful to their survival? Now, getting back to the basic kind of biological needs for food and energy and then sex and reproduction, with that in mind, what did the brain develop so we can acquire these things and so that we'd be motivated to seek after these things? So how do you design something like that? And the question leads us to, well, you want something pretty accurate, adaptive, sensitive. So you want a system in the brain that can kind of survey your environment and detect the things that are rewarding, that give us pleasure or give us some sort of value. So in terms of the brain's reward system, it is very efficient, very effective in getting us to seek out rewarding things, including food. So it helped our ancestors in survival and reproduction to get us here. So just to give a mini neural anatomy lesson, I'm not going to go into too much depth, but basically you can divide the brain into two general sections, and you have this outer layer called the cortex, which is the most advanced and helps us complete or carry out complex tasks like decision making, how to control our behavior. But if you look in that pink area, and I'm going to pass this around in a second, you actually have a set of subcortical structures. Now these down here, well, let me do it right side up. So these here on each side, laterally, part of that subcortical section is called the striatum. And there's a part of the ventral striatum, ventral means lower, so to orient us, ventral, dorsal, lateral on the side, medial towards the middle. Those are that's the nomenclature to orient us around the brain. So the ventral, the lower part of the striatum, has a bunch of cells that are dopamine rich. They receive signaling from even a deeper structure. But the point is that this is a very primitive but effective mechanism to get us to recognize rewarding things in our environment, whether it be food or drug or a potential mate. So it's a very effective system. But then what happens is that the signaling from these subcortical structures they course up into the prefrontal cortex for further processing. So the prefrontal cortex then might kind of change the signal a bit based on your current state, where you can't eat that right now, or you can't just have sex with a random person on the street, so you need to engage in control. And your prefrontal cortex is having an influence there. So you can pass this around, and again, like when you feel this in your hands, it's smaller than you think it would be, but there's a lot of density in like how the structures come together and all the functions they serve. So, are there any questions so far? Trying to get us on the same page so we can kind of launch forward into other things? No questions? You guys are...
Well, I'm just thinking,
Yeah.
It's not always rewarding. I mean, what is attracted to
Right.
that activates that, so
Right.
I guess we'll get into that, but.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because you have kind of the basic rewarding signal, but based on your current needs, your current context, that can change that a lot. Exactly. So that's kind of the neural system for reward that we're all equipped with, but it gets vastly more complicated from there and interesting in terms of what modern neuroscience can tell us about how the brain processes reward in response specifically to food rewards, and that'll be what we're focusing on tonight. So interestingly, this reward system can be tuned up in a very individualized fashion. So if you have a specific craving for a certain type of food, that means you've had past experience with that food that's been rewarding, and your reward system has been tuned up to respond to that specifically. But it's interesting because you can almost imagine infinite flexibility of how the system can be tuned up and conditioned. So for some people, they might struggle with chocolate cake. For others, it might be another type of food. So it's not one-to-one, and it's not the same across all persons. And it's not just in the food domain that the reward system is recruited and used. So you could imagine if someone struggles with drug addiction, it's the same neural system, so the ventral striatum. And then I should also say that, this is not as easy to demonstrate with, the ventral part of the prefrontal cortex, I haven't talked about it, it's called the orbital frontal cortex because it sits on top of the orbits of your eyes. So if you remember just seeing a skull or a skeleton, you see the tops of the orbits of the eyes. And this part right here, the prefrontal cortex, the orbital frontal cortex, is also involved in reward as well. And so this reward system is pretty powerful in terms of how much it can adapt to the things that we call our vices, whether it be in the food domain or the drug domain. And to get more into the research, the recent research, our lab at Dartmouth, so I'm a grad student with Todd Heatherton and Bill Kelly, and actually Alex is a new grad student, he's here in the audience as well in that lab. And we study reward in the brain, and we use MRI, so the same technology you'd use at a hospital to get maybe a bone looked at or something like that, but we use it to see the brain in action. So what MRI can do, or functional MRI can do, is actually take kind of pictures of the brain in succession so that we get an unfolding picture, like an aggregate picture, of what the brain activity is over time. So over time, we could then show people appetizing food images or other stimuli. And then we can say, okay, which are the brain areas that are responding to the certain types of stimuli that we present. So in our lab, we administer something called a cue reactivity paradigm. And we show different types of cues, primarily appetizing food images, like I said, but also erotic cues, so sexual cues, and also alcohol cues. So other domains of reward. And a really cool finding done by someone in our lab before me found that you can actually show this individualized tuning of the reward system, because if we show people food images, right, the extent to which the reward system activates to the food images, it actually predicts weight gain 6 months later. And this was in a cohort of college freshmen. So you can imagine when you're starting college, you're trying to get a handle on your behavior. You're not under the roof of your mother and father anymore. You're your parents' house, and you're trying to kind of live on your own. So then there's a lot of variability based on your reward system, and if your reward system is more sensitive to food cues, you're more likely to gain weight. And in a study I did, it showed that, but on a smaller time scale. So if I show you appetizing food images, you're more likely to have stronger food desires in general in your day-to-day life and eat more. So that happens both in the micro scale, within like a week or two, but also over the long term, because then it compounds into weight gain potentially. So interestingly, those participants who had the higher reward system activity in response to food specifically showed higher weight gain. And then interestingly, those participants who showed higher reward system activity in response to erotic cues reported having more sexual partners over that year. But it's a double dissociation. Who's heard that phrase before? Double dissociation. It's a very interesting effect in science. So it means you can kind of account for both effects by them not crossing over fully. So the food activity predicted weight gain, but it didn't predict sexual activity. The sexual activity predicted sexual partners, but not weight gain. So that's kind of a key distinguishing factor. So again, that shows how versatile our reward system is in predicting our behavior over time. Yeah?
Which parts of the brain did you notice activity?
Okay, so the area that I had already mentioned, the ventral striatum. So that was that subcortical structure that's pretty primitive, but it is kind of governing our behavior if left unchecked.
Okay.
Good question. So that's kind of one set of studies. Another set of studies kind of looked at more of the contextual effects that would maybe drive reward system activity. So how many of you have found yourself at the supermarket late at night, and you've had a stressful day, and you're still kind of stressed, you're tired, and when you're in that state, does it affect what you buy?
Definitely.
Affects what I buy for sure, but for most of us, many of us, right? So interestingly, in the lab, we can simulate this exact scenario by putting people in a stressed or anxious state, and then immediately look at their reward system activity in response to food cues. So we're still using that food cue reactivity paradigm, but we first manipulate, we administer a task that gets them stressed or gets them tired or fatigued. Then we look at their reward system. And in multiple studies, 3 or 4 in our lab and in others now showing this as well, your reward system kind of gets hypersensitive. So the key thing here, if there's a takeaway, more of a point of application, is try to be aware of yourself when you're in this state or in these types of states, because it is going to affect how your brain is responding to rewarding cues, and then it'll later affect your behavior. So you have kind of these long-term behavioral differences. You have these short-term state effects of stress or anxiety. But what about interesting interactions that can get us thinking about maybe more societal level issues? And this was something I chatted about with Amanda and Chris, and I wanted to bring it into tonight's discussion as well. So let's kind of think together through this. Let's think of an inner city environment. Let's think of a low socioeconomic status group within that inner city environment. Okay, so these are folks who are either maybe nearing the poverty line or pretty low income folks, and they're in a particular neighborhood in an inner city. So, in general, how would you, just guessing, how would you characterize maybe their stress levels chronically? Anxiety, emotion, right, and just the stress of maybe living in an urban environment, also trying to put food on the table for your family, just having more demands and pressures. And that's taxing your brain in terms of your emotions, your stress. So you have that working against you, right, if you're one of these folks. Now, here's the rub. What types of food are available to you? If you're in that group, in that context.
Garbage.
Garbage.
Dude, garbage.
Starch.
Sugar, salt, oil.
Yeah.
Prepackaged.
And how, okay, so we have these types of folks with their brains not in good shape to begin with all of these factors, the type of food, and then how much does this food cost compared to healthy food that would really be good for them and for anyone, for all of us, but cheaper.
It tends to be much cheaper,
Yeah.
especially when you're on a tight budget.
And it's much advertised.
Is it not the perfect storm
Yes.
for an obesity crisis that we're seeing? And we're seeing it a lot in the inner city, but also a lot in the South. But it's a recent phenomenon. Yeah.
Well, I used to teach in inner city Chicago
Yeah.
before. I now teach in the Hanover school system, and I was working with this exact population. And it's then doubled down upon because most of these people rely on the school systems for a fair amount of their caloric intake.
Right.
And they end up getting the cheapest processed food. I work at Richmond Middle School in Hanover. Our kids get swordfish, These kids would get starch, more starch, and a Twinkie. It was terrible, and they can't. Yeah, it just makes everything.
Right.
Also,
Yeah.
I like that they are now advertising the food stamp program, what is it,
Oh yeah.
Foursquare,
Mhm.
that are Three Square. They're telling you that you can get healthy food and that you can use them at farm markets and
Mhm.
stuff. So it's starting.
Now, but interestingly, let me ask you this: Are these people's reward systems functioning well? Well,
The system's working all right.
oh, they are, right? Because this brain system was developed in a completely different context to work well in that context. Our species has never seen this context in which we live today, in terms of the superabundance of food and food availability, but the problem of really cheap, processed, unhealthy foods. And it's so recent. I mean, really, you could track it only back maybe to the Industrial Revolution, once you had mass production, through today, where now you have major distribution. Do you want to
I was going to say,
Yeah.
it seems really tied into the end stage capitalism, and it has to do a lot with our entire system. We're at a point where we produce things not necessarily for their actual benefit to society, but for profit to make more capital. And when that's the bottom line, everything else gets put aside.
There is a really good book on that topic. It's called The Taste of War, and it looks at how war and the stakes of war in industrialized countries heavily influenced the patterns of food production in order to feed the populations of countries that were at war, and how the British Empire reconfigured food production in all of its empire countries, and then how America also reconfigured its food production to basically make high fat content, high calorific content food available to a large group of people, not only in this country, but they were also subsidizing Britain. So it really stems from that, and that has not changed. So it's a good book, The Taste of War, it's called.
Are falling glucose levels always involved or not always?
You mean when people
Could you repeat
When,
the
when,
question?
when they're under stress,
oh
when they're stressed.
falling glucose levels?
Glucose levels, yeah.
I don't. That's more in the periphery of your body where that's measured. It's not so much affecting the neurochemistry and just in kind of the central nervous system of how these brain processes are unfolding. But you bring up a good point where there are a lot of signals that we get internally in terms of seeking out food. But I guess what I want to, but think of it that way. Those things have always been there in terms of hormone levels, glucose levels for our species. Now it's more the external environment that has just thrown everything off. And the kind of funny or strange thing is that nowadays one of the biggest areas of self-control is eating, where that shouldn't be the case because we have that superabundance of food. And it's unprecedented, really, that now we have to control, basic kind of biological need or drive. And something that we already kind of started talking about is that it's a little scary. I did this once in a supermarket. If you look at any product, no matter how variable they're marketed or the different sub-brands and sub-companies, it could all be traced back to 2 to 4, give or take, major food companies. So the question then is, how are food companies, it's almost like kind of the trajectory that big tobacco has taken, because you had kind of the uproar in the 80s, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's when that really started to come to a head, and with the Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, also bringing a lot of public awareness to the tobacco industry. I think now we're seeing that in the food industry, but now there's like a backlash where foods are now rebranded to be seen as healthier. No high fructose corn syrup. That's what I look for, and then I say, oh, I'm good, and I put it in my cart. But we want to be careful because there might be other ingredients, other additives, other preservatives. And again, as I say all this, I don't want us to all be neurotic, although as New Englanders, I think we skew that way sometimes when it comes to healthy eating, and that's okay. But we just want to bring a little bit more mindfulness to the decisions we make in the grocery store, because a thing that I want to emphasize is that the food companies have modified the sugar, salt, and fat content in just the right combinations so that subjectively we experience these foods as most rewarding. Yeah.
You just mentioned mindfulness.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know, has any of your research touched upon that and its interaction with brain function and reward system?
That's an excellent question. Mine hasn't, and our lab hasn't really gone that way, but several labs in the country I know who are doing the neuroscience work in this area are looking at that. And they're looking at mindfulness meditation techniques to see if that can change one's awareness of internal craving states. And if bringing that awareness to mind and to the forefront of your mind, if that's actually going to be a regulation strategy, a way you can control your craving. Yeah, did you say?
And I was just gonna ask something I was thinking about earlier, was once you know that this is your response pattern, does just knowing that create any changes in the behavior?
That's another good question.
I mean, mindfulness is almost like another level of,
Sure.
of
Right.
intent. But yeah.
No, that's true. I think it really depends on the person and how beset they are with maybe a habit or a behavior that they've struggled with. And in the domain of eating, if you have someone who's really struggling with restricting their food intake, it's going to be especially difficult no matter what strategy they use. But you have to think, how are these processes mediated in the brain? And there's so many different systems I could mention tonight, in addition to the reward system. I'm going to mention one more, the learning and memory system. So remember I was talking about the striatum, that subcortical structure. I was talking about the ventral striatum, which has neurons that are specialized for reward. If you go dorsally up in the striatum, can you hand me the brain juice?
That's the brain.
Actually, I'm going to stand up a bit just for. Yeah. So you have the striatum in here, in that deep in there, but in the more dorsal top parts of it, you have now kind of the learning system, because think of anything that's rewarding, it's going to require a behavior, because now you have a conditioned response. But the thing is, we're still in the subcortex right now. These are relatively automatic processes that have been conditioned, and we're not consciously thinking about them at any given point. So what needs to happen is almost tricking your subcortical learning system to have a new or something that'll become an automatic behavior or habit. So in short, only habits can replace habits. Now again, this is not, the jury might still be out on how much the research is going to follow up on that, but it seems like so far really like what might be most effective in the long run is to develop new habits, because the thing about exerting effort and using your prefrontal cortex is that takes more energy. That if you have more neurons in your prefrontal cortex requiring that effortful conscious control, that's more taxing. And ideally, you want to kind of find a new groove of behavior where you're going to develop these new habits of mind, but then they become habits, actual habits. So translating to your behavior. Yeah. So that's a very good question. And this brings up another point that how often, right? How often do you just find yourself engaged in a behavior? This is a more general question. This goes beyond eating. How often you're like, wait, I started doing this. Wait, what? Like how often? Be honest. It happens to me a good deal.
Every day.
Yeah,
Every day.
it'll probably happen every day in some way. And not to get too philosophical, but I will for a second, that I think we're limited right now. Our brain function is not all that it can be. And outside of maybe kind of a spiritual transformation or something to really get us to move beyond the limitations of our brains, we are limited, and we will find ourselves in these automatic habits and ruts of behavior. So it's not a good picture. However, like I said, we can kind of develop these new habits. Yeah.
You seem to be casting habits in a negative light.
No, I don't mean to. They're
Okay,
neutral.
Okay.
They should. I see them as neutral.
Okay.
Like, and sorry, I should have maybe said those habits that aren't healthy for us or they're detrimental that we want to improve upon. But yeah, but a habit is
Because
neutral.
I find habits very useful.
Oh, yes.
It means I can do things unconsciously and I don't have to pay attention to.
Exactly. No. And it depends on what you're doing, but yes, no, that's absolutely right. And they can be very.
Exactly. A good example.
That's a good thing.
And so this is to say that oftentimes we are on autopilot, but we need to check our autopilot. We need to get a handle on what are the things we just find ourselves doing. Why am I doing this? And it's even like a heart check in your motivation. Why am I doing this really? Yeah.
That also apply to maybe not something as physical as eating, but thought processes as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And being able to recognize just the thought process or the reaction
Mm-hmm.
that I think many people fall into automatically without even realizing why they're saying or thinking or feeling what they're feeling.
Right.
So with that, then is it maybe not, as you said earlier, that we're limited by our brains, but that we're limited by the knowledge of our brains,
It's possible. Yeah.
parts
Yeah.
of our brains that
Yeah.
we overuse?
Right.
I mean, is there a greater capacity that is underused in our brains?
It's very possible and untapped maybe. But yeah, that's a good point. And then another thing I wanted to bring our attention to, even though it's going outside the domain of eating, is I'm really worried for the human race in that apps, devices, media are really messing with us neurally. Because what's happened, oh my gosh, I mean really if you think about it, think of Candy Crush for example. And you have this problem of getting...
Some of us are clueless.
Oh, sorry, no.
I know it's a game.
No, it's not moral judgment, but I'm just bringing...
Candy Crush is.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry, I thought
yeah.
you said...
I'm like, how many people here don't know what Candy Crush is?
Oh, I thought you were saying you were an avid user.
Oh, no, no.
So it's I don't play it myself, but someone who plays it can help me. But it's an addictive game. Who plays it? Someone must play it in here. Okay, Amanda. So it's an addictive game whereby you get points, and it's very visually stimulating and sounds and just bings and zings and all these things. And but think of if you're an app developer, an entrepreneur, and you want to develop an app that's going to be hot, that's going to reach the top 10 or 5 or 20 list on the App Store or something like that. You want the game to be as addictive as possible. And what's happened, and this is my greater concern for the human race right now, is that we can no longer really sit still. And I don't care if you're 5 years old or 25 or 65 or whatever your age is. We can't sit still anymore. We can't just wait, really, because there's a restlessness that's running underneath us that's just and try this, and I've tried this, I've failed at it. Like go home, block everything out, just sit in a chair, not super bright lighting, and just sit for 5 minutes. And you're
That's
gonna
a
be,
long time.
and right, it'll feel like an eternity. And that's telling. It's telling of the fact that our brains, in our current experience in our modern culture, have been shaped not for the better, but for worse. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, so I'm an art teacher, right? Teaching middle school. And whereas when I was learning how to draw, my friends were learning how to draw. Sure, we were looking at Marvel Comics and we were watching TV and we were doing all these things, but we were developing our own style. Kids today are learning formulaic manga style, like the Japanese manga, which is step-by-step process. So yes, they're learning a certain rote skill, and it's hitting all these bells and whistles because at the end they have big glistening eyes and like features that these kids are completely conditioned to like.
Right.
But they're not developing. They're not branching out in the wild and woolly way that it takes, and I see that all over the place. So and this is a little off the track, but I just wanted to squeeze it in because you brought up mindfulness, and this is really touching on using all of these bells and whistles, like visual things and sound, to get us into a state of unconscious consumerism. Again, when you have capitalism, and I'm not like I didn't come here like put a pitchfork or anything, but I'm just saying when your goal is to sell things and you work towards that goal. I used to live in the foothills of Tibet, where there is a very aggressive form of intellectual debate that goes on within the Buddhist community that involves sound and movement, and when someone is leading something, they will smack their hands together or snap their fingers to snap someone out of a particular line of thought, literally to change up the way that they're thinking and allow them to redirect. So while this can be used for less than great, it also seems to have potential for us to use as a tool as well. So I just wondering if you might want to comment a little bit on that.
Right. I mean, as Uncle Ben tells Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Like we have, I think, and speaking also to what Amanda is getting at, I think we don't know how best to use our capacities or in what combination. But these things in of themselves and how our brains have been wired up, it's neutral. It's morally neutral. I'll even say that. But it's what we do. It's how we are affected by our environments. And all types of sensory stimuli. And if there's a little bit of hope as well, I mean, I was talking about the subcortical learning system. There's actually another area I want to bring to your attention. So here's a midline view of the brain. So if imagine you slice my brain in half and then, looking this way. So here you have, here's the subcortex. It's like sliced through the middle. And the striatum over here. But here you have, you'll notice a lot of prefrontal cortex. And recent research in social neuroscience is showing that there's a sweet spot right here. Actually, there's a lot I can say about this. And there's a lot I can say because we don't know what's going on here, but in this part of the brain. But basically, what happens is that inputs from the reward system course up into this part of the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and get integrated. And they get integrated to basically create an output for behavior. So if you have, like what we were talking about before, like something might be rewarding but maybe not in the moment or for some other reason in your context, all of those different factors get integrated effectively in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and then an output for behavior is generated, more or less, and a decision boundary is made in terms of, okay, am I going to do this or not? But the great thing about this mechanism here is that it's also very flexible. So if over time you add value, or value grows for a behavior or a thought that wasn't there before, you're trying to foster it in yourself and encourage it, then this brain system will help you in that. But the problem is at the get-go, it's very difficult to do this because you're getting out of another way of thinking, another habit, and kind of going into another one altogether. But
so you're saying, I don't think I understand what you just said. How does it build up and spill over?
Okay, so
And how is that difficult at the beginning?
okay, so there's other stuff I didn't mention that maybe I can mention now too. Thank you. That what happens here is that you have the output for behavior. So you imagine like hundreds of feedback loops that are bidirectional between subcortex and prefrontal cortex. So I'm simplifying it by saying, oh, it starts here and then it courses up into this part. It's not that simple. It's roughly what's going on, but what's really happening is you have these feedback loops. And let me backstep and say, one tenet of neurobiology is neurons that fire together, wire together. So that idea is that if you have a set behavior or set thought, your brain doesn't want to take the extra effort or energy to create new pathways. It wants to use the pathways that have already been laid down, even including in this area where you're trying to integrate different things that you care about, rewarding or other values you have, and then come to a decision. So initially, it's difficult because you have kind of this ingrained conditioned response, even in your prefrontal cortex as well, because that's a general feature of how neurons respond across the brain. But you can transition into a more kind of automatic kind of habit of mind if you cross that initial threshold. It's not unlike training for something and for running. Like if you're just starting, you're running a few miles is tough, but if you get past that threshold, it actually gets a bit easier. Or it's that initial push is tough. But yeah, so does that answer it maybe? Ish.
So you're just saying, once you get your habit started, it will accumulate, like the ease will build up.
Right, because a thing that I forgot to mention or say is that the brain, we think, with the current science, is pretty plastic. You're faced with difficulty, especially for hard set habits, but it is plastic, and you can have new pathways and new conditioned responses altogether. Yeah.
Yes,
No, go ahead, I've talked a lot.
you did talk a lot.
It's true.
I'm interested in how we're going about, I'm totally bought into how we've been conditioned,
Yeah.
but how are we gonna change those neural pathways? And how, as a society, are we gonna
Ooh.
help change them? I mean, I hear a lot about neural pathways and changing them, that they can be changed,
Yes.
even through hands-on meditation.
Sure.
So,
Okay. There's so many things I can. One thing is, if you have someone, I'm going to talk about the placebo effect for a second. If you have someone who believes that a certain method is effective and has a deep motivation or need to believe that it's going to help them, then regardless of the method, they're going to show an effect. So it's really tough in empirical studies to guard against that. And that what that means then is you want to be very careful about the population of participants you select, because think about it. If you're on a bus and you're severely depressed, but it's you know, and you'll try anything. You're now in a very desperate, very unique state, right? And you see an ad for a study at DHMC, and then only the people who are in that state are the ones who are going to contact DHMC to sign up for the study. So you have, it's tricky, because I don't think at the end of the day there's going to be one method or even 5. I think there are going to be many. And they're going to work sometimes through neurochemistry, so it might be pharmaceuticals, other times through pure kind of cognitive therapy, like getting, but here's the thing, it's a misnomer to break down therapeutic programs into drug-based or like talk-based therapy. Because right now, your brain's changing based on what I'm telling you. So how different is that from you taking a drug that's changing your brain? Because the reciprocal relationship between our brain activity and what we do and what we interact, you can't draw a hard and fast line and say the direction's only this way or it's only this way. Because the brain changes behavior, and behavior changes the brain, and the brain changes behavior, and the behavior changes the brain ad nauseum. But that's our experience as human beings. So that's not an answer, and it's probably not a helpful one. but that's all to
Well,
say.
I'm assuming that research is being done.
Yes. So it really depends on the population. It depends on which disorder, because you have unique characteristics, whether it's anxiety or depression, or take your pick, schizophrenia, like any of these. And the problem within each of these disorders here, so this is getting complicated, is that you have so much variability. So even within depression, or even within an anxiety disorder, how do you generalize? How do you? So really, kind of the new approach in research, and basic research and applied research, is individualized treatments, and even a new way to reconceive mental disorders writ large. So there was a recent paper. So the NIMH, what's the guy's name? Oh, Insel, INSEL. I'm forgetting his first name. He's one of the heads of the NIMH. And he put out a paper where he's kind of knocking, who's heard of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual? So that's kind of the Bible, so to speak, of psychiatric and psychological kind of diagnoses.
You need it for insurance purposes.
Well, right, and there's that whole part of it too. But Insel and others from the NIMH are saying, look, the more that we learn about how different these disorders can be from person to person, even though we're categorizing them as the same disorder, is that we need to be really smart about considering that person. But then what level do you stop it at, right? Because you don't want 300, 400 treatments for depression, because that's not feasible. But I don't think you could have as few as 5. So it's like, I'm just throwing numbers out there. But where do we find a level where we can adequately treat and help people while taking into account individual differences? Yeah.
Can I just say something
Sure.
too? So, multifocal approach to change behavior is often most optimal. So, pharmacokinetics or pharmacology is one way that you can treat it, but it also has to do with the cognitive behavior modification as well. So, like counseling linked with an antidepressant is the best way, and again, it's individualizing it to that person to help meet the greater overall treatment of changing that plastic brain. So there's a lot of things that have to take place, and even changing environment can help with certain people. So again, individualized medicine is kind of where we're the trajectory of a lot of these.
It's a little bit of a shift.
That's fine.
You talked about technologies and used Candy Crush, is that what it's called?
Yes.
Sorry, as an example of a technology that can have a side effect of shorten our attention span, the phrase, the folks. Can you talk a little bit about technologies that can help us achieve those?
Okay. Yeah. This is. Oh man. Okay. So who's heard of
Or anything.
Lumosity? The company Lumosity. So you might have seen some advertising. And basically, this is a company with people with some neuroscience background trying to develop brain games to improve brain function. And they kind of focus on some of the classical cognitive domains. Working memory, how many things can you hold in mind and maintain that over a task? And that is a sign of like good executive functioning. So that's kind of like a classic kind of cognitive domain of thought there. But Lumosity, what it purports to do is train you up in these domains. But the question is, if you improve on that, does it generalize? Or is it actually going to help you in your day-to-day life? And actually, another person in our lab, Andy, is developing an app to control eating behavior. And it's using the same idea as Lumosity, but it's a little bit more specific. Because remember, when we're talking about the reward system, it really depends on that specific domain. So it's trying to inhibit your response to food cues specifically. So this is a huge debate in the training world. So there are a bunch of labs looking at this question, using technology to train up your brain for the better. And it's an age-old debate, even in psychology, is domain general versus domain specific. So if you train up someone in working memory, are they going to be better able to control their food intake? So those are different domains. Or how specific do you need to get in terms of the exact task that you want to get better at? But there is a lot of promise with it, but I don't think it's conclusive as to whether those types of technology, those programs administered through devices, it's not clear. I mean, there's some initial studies saying that it is beneficial, but I don't have a lot of faith yet, only because it's so new. It's like literally in the last 2 or 3 years that all these companies have been jumping to that. And you want to wait until the dust settles after that initial
I was actually thinking of a much different technology.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It doesn't matter.
No,
I mean,
what were you
all
thinking?
technologies that might be useful.
Yeah.
The binaural beat technology, where different frequencies, slightly different frequencies, are fed into each ear.
I'm not familiar with that. What is that?
The most famous company that does it is Centerpoint. They have a product called Holosync, but it was developed by I don't remember what the organization was now. I can send you some links if you're interested. But it's supposed to. I actually use it. I find it helpful for meditation. And for sort of achieving more. Okay, yeah.
Oh no, I just had a thought, and I mean that's interesting, right? So what is that really getting at? What cognitive process is that helping you with? It's probably affecting your attentional system generally, where you're doing this and your attention is, you're focusing your attention in a certain way. So you're almost priming the pump in a general fashion, maybe for your brain, that would then be effective for other things. Because anytime, given how much we talked about the autopilot problem, anytime you change kind of your attentional system and bring awareness, or the fact that you're doing this intentionally, right? When you bring your attention to the moment for a specific thing, regardless of what you're doing, like that's probably a better state to be in, but where you're blocking out other distractions as well. So you're getting kind of this kind of pure state, but that's just me speculating. But
that's an interesting speculation. I mean, it sounds like I may be attaining a certain state that I can then apply as I see fit.
Right, or the fact that you're doing that is going to help you, later today doing something totally different, and you don't even know that it's helping you do that. Because you think of sleep. We don't have control over our sleep. We just sleep. Yet our memories are consolidated, and of all our neural pathways, affected by the day's events and the day's thoughts and ruminations and anxieties, that's all being kind of filtered and reconsolidated, and that's helpful. So but we don't know exactly what that's doing.
That's too bad. That's a fascinating area.
Yeah, they're looking into that too. For sure, yeah.
So given that there's lots of beautiful stimuli for
Yes.
food,
Yes.
and that we have ample access to amazing food,
Yes.
what would you suggest so that we're not constantly having to monitor ourselves and
Yeah.
have a cerebral cortex event.
Yeah.
So we can just eat. What would be your suggestion?
So like self-control failure, which is what I study, like where people are most prone to give into temptation. I think the best way to nip it in the bud is at the time of cue exposure. So if you never expose yourself to that cue, you're not going to struggle with the temptation. And it's kind of a drastic approach, but the idea is that if you're not putting yourself in that context, it'll be very hard for, like it would create a lot more for you to do to get to the cue. Like if you don't have that, maple glazed donut at home that you really want, and you have to, like, it's 11 o'clock and you have to drive to get it. I mean, if you really have a problem with maple glazed donuts, you are going to go out there and late at night and acquire them. But the point is, like, you want to start changing your environment so that the cues and the things you come across daily are not going to be as problematic. But the interesting thing is the act of doing that is changing your brain, because you're now bringing more intention and awareness to it. But again, it's that reciprocal thing. Yeah.
I just wanted, if you might go back to
Yeah.
where you're talking about only a habit can replace a habit.
Right.
And I'm interested, do you mean that like almost physically in terms of the actual pathways you lay down?
Yeah, well, in a way, yeah, because the learning system and then the value integration happening in the prefrontal cortex, over time, something's going to become habitual. So the question is, what is that going to be? And like for me, like whether it's like exercise or things, I'm trying to make things become just a part of my daily routine, where it doesn't feel like a struggle. It doesn't feel like, oh, I have to do that now. It's like, no, I kind of want to do that because it's become a part of what I value, and it's become, I don't have to think about it as much. So how can we get to the point where brushing our teeth and eating healthy and exercise, like how can we get that all in kind of the same thing? But it's hard in our current environment. Yeah. Did you?
No, I was just
Oh,
Education. I think educating ourselves, and this is where it gets back to the beginning where someone was talking about advertising.
Yeah.
And some of the food companies, they know
Right.
how to manipulate words or the thoughts into
Right.
words that
Right.
will trigger somebody to
Yes.
react. You
Yes.
say, I want that Twinkie,
Yes.
or I want that really luscious looking whoopie pie. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
When I have found myself to be better educated about a topic, then my intention becomes different.
Yes.
So I'm actually in charge of my ego at some level is
Sure.
in charge of my intention. And if I can get my intention to get on the same bandwagon as
Yep.
the rest of me,
Yep.
then there's the hope that I won't reach for the Twinkie.
And I should say a dimension we've totally neglected in all of this is the social dimension. Accountability, the people around you. Here's the thing, if people you associate with always eat fried food, you're going to eat fried food a lot. And you might love them to death as friends, as dear friends, but it's like, okay, you have to maybe take certain steps. But I mean, what you brought up is right, but it just, I don't know why I thought of that just now. I know that doesn't relate to what you were saying.
No, in a way it does, because
Okay.
it's a social influence.
Yes.
And that is also educational.
Yes. Yes.
And you have to discern
Right.
what we want to keep or what we want to let go.
Right, because again, if there's kind of a group habit of going out and eating or drinking, I mean, it's gonna be even more difficult maybe to break away from that. But if you surround yourself with people who kind of share your values or have at least that willingness and to engage and to increase even the group level intention on it, then I think that could be really helpful.
Well, I noticed that in looking at what's going on in the Upper Valley on Listener, including this, everyone said refreshments will be served. And that was kind of an oxymoron. I mean,
That's true.
Can you go any place where refreshments aren't served, so you don't have?
Would you go any place where?
Refreshment will be denied.
You'll be refreshed in other ways.
Good point.
Yeah, any other questions or?
I'm just,
That's, yeah.
in the big picture of this, with the television advertising and the bottom line that's so important to
Yes.
the big companies
Yes.
and stuff, how are you ever, I mean, you can't stop that ball from rolling. Turn it off.
No, but you can just turn it
Well, I don't
off.
have a TV, but I mean, it's
Right.
a Nintendo.
No, turning it off doesn't just mean TV. Turning it off means don't buy into it. Whatever you hear, see,
But how are we ever gonna be able to influence people to do that? Where do you start? What do you do?
by being educated and motivated.
I might suggest learning how they make food commercials. That's a good way to start. The milk that you see dripping off
It's
of the
not
cereal.
milk.
It's owner's glue.
Yeah.
It's not real.
Yeah.
The cereal doesn't look like that.
Yeah.
The hamburger
Enlarged
has
to
been
show
spray
texture
painted.
on the cereal.
It's wrong. What you are gonna get is not gonna be what your eyes have already devoured.
Right.
Your stomach is gonna be
That's why it
motivated
looks
for
better than
something
it
that
tastes
lies.
sometimes when you finally get it.
Absolutely.
Yes, but I have already sort of done that by getting rid of my television and stuff.
That
But
helps.
now I just eat. You know, I forget and I went, oh my God, I ate that. Or I go, oh gosh, I get in bed and I go, oh, I didn't do any exercise today. Go figure. It's just not ingrained yet.
See, I have challenges like that as well, so I actually schedule out my day. And it's, you know, for this amount of time, this activity. Say,
Really?
sadly,
When I
yes.
retired, I said I'm never gonna do that.
No schedules. Darling, I'm sorry, that's what works for me. I'm sorry.
Okay, but in a bigger picture, where do you start to teach our kids to learn to eat well, which they are doing now?
Mhm.
How do you teach us older people to stop eating the way we've eaten for 60 years? Where do you start? How
That's
does that?
back to him. I have no idea now.
How do you get the brain to start?
Don't buy the stuff at the grocery store and bring it home.
But that's only one person. You know,
So
one
well,
person can do that.
There
But
you go.
how are we gonna get that influence away from
One
us?
person at a time.
Exactly.
Oh.
Start here.
Yeah.
And there is I have a friend who's a dietitian, and I know he's a nutritionist, and he has a program where he teaches people how to cook healthily with real food, not processed or packaged food. They're on very low budgets. It's usually people in low socioeconomic brackets, which is a lot of us at this point. And being able to make the right choices so they can put together a healthy and nutritious and cheap meal. And what he says is there is a sort of divide in terms of who can afford to be healthy and eat the healthy food, and then the perception is, well, that's not for me because I can't afford to have a green smoothie every day, even though green smoothies are not actually good for you. But the perception is that the health food is owned by the wealthy and packaged food is for the rest of us. And that is also an interesting aspect of how the brain works, right? If you are in a situation where you're constantly stressed, you're really faced with all these pressures to choose, that pressure you into making unhealthy food choices, and then you have this other group of people who are much less stressed, much more surrounded by very healthy food options, and they have the money to afford them because they do tend to be more expensive. Does that create, are those brain functions in those two sort of groups, generally speaking, being solidified? I mean, how permanent are those patterns? And then how, okay, so the brain may be plastic, and is the plasticity of the brain equal to the plasticity of society, or does that
Well, that's
then create this huge, well,
That's a good
you
point,
all are
because-
poor, y'all are eating rubbish food, and you just don't make good choices,
Right.
therefore, and how does that play out?
Well, right. I mean, the brain has to be plastic or responding to something. So if nothing in the environment is substantively changing, then the brain is not going to change, even with education. So it's tricky because I think we've well identified all the different factors, and they're all at play at the same time. So I don't have an easy answer when it comes to kind of these larger societal dynamics. I mean, I kind of laid out why it's the perfect storm for what we're seeing, so and accounting for it. But going forward, it's tricky. I mean, even when it comes to not to get political, but just thinking just practically when it comes to governing and legislating. Like, at what scale is governing like effective, like for these things? I mean, our country is quite large, right? Over 300 million people. Whereas other European countries that maybe do better in some of these things than we do, right? They're dealing with maybe 10 million people or 7 million people. So it's like, I don't know. It's hard because, again, you have a lot of variability in how these things are how these brain systems are being affected. And you do want to come to some generalities, but then I don't know how easy that is sometimes at scale.
I would think that to watch, let's say, an alcoholic or a drug addict,
Yeah.
they go through rehab, they get educated, all that kind of thing. But there's something inside them that makes them want to stop. That's self-motivation. Without self-motivation, you're not going to change those habits. You're not going to bring in the new habits because it's just too easy to slip back into the old ways. So I see self-determination and the accountability and the responsibility towards self and the desire for change has got to come from within the individual person, not just socially because the packaging gets changed, but it's got to come because the person wants to change.
Right, and the tricky part is that, I mean, in cases of very severe addiction, where you have someone who might even claim to, I really want to get rid of this habit or to not abuse this drug anymore. If the reward system is so far gone in that individual, like, I don't know. I mean, it could be very difficult, even if they want to, with all their heart, to change. But again, it's just like no two cases are the same. I think you're right though in that there has to be some X factor that's internal, that has to be there. And like,
because otherwise it's going to be you, do it to me, do it for me, because I can't do it for myself.
Right.
That's where the bottom line can come down for some people.
Yeah.
They want the pill, the drug, the other person to do it for them.
Right.
May I make a comment?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not necessarily that they want the pill, the drug. What they want is to alter their realities and not feel the hurt that they have inside of them, and they're looking to escape any way possible. So a lot of it, I would suggest, could perhaps be dealt with not just in rehab and this is bad for you, but in counseling and building up their self-esteem so that whatever hurts have been done to them in the past, they can let go of the pain. And by doing that, because
I would agree with you, 100%.
And isn't that what you're talking about? Change your habits?
It's changing, and then that changes the nerve structure inside the brain, blah, blah, blah.
And I mean, again, like, this is, I'm amazed at how many things are being, we're talking about, and it's encouraging, but this touches on the issue of like, why do people seek these things out in the first place, or like, why are they going to this extent? And a lot of times it comes from, maybe not having, like loved ones or people, like it can be all these factors that drive a person to do it, but yeah, you don't want to just address the problem at the end of it. You want to address the whole person and get a holistic sense of their motivations and their story, and no two stories are the same.
and some of them don't even recognize how profoundly deep some of the stuff goes.
Oh, right.
That's motivating them to this self-destructive behavior.
Yes.
So it's actually quite
Oh,
fascinating.
it is.
If you go back to the food industry though, if sugar is indeed addictive, which I think it is, we've been fed it forever in everything. And so therefore, to break that addiction, it's kind of a hidden addiction in a way.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you're at the point where you can't stop eating, you're really overweight and blah, 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 and you say what to do about it. That's where you have to take some action. You have to surrender to it, I think. See it.
And how much of this is cultural too? Like, how much of this is because people are just, like, you can talk about it being because they're dealing with things that are difficult in their lives and they want the solace, but how much of it just boils down to just being disempowered and not feeling like you can do anything? And I'm just thinking, during World War II, Alaska was invaded and a bunch of Native Alaskans were put into concentration camps where they were literally suffered from a lot of disease and a lot of malnutrition and a lot of like premature deaths that frankly they've really been vocal about was caused by the fact that they weren't allowed to forage, that they weren't allowed to pursue their traditional means. And I think that, so how much of this is just that we don't know that we can do these things. We don't have victory gardens anymore.
Right. Yeah, that's.
There's a difference between a food addiction and drugs and alcohol. You can't stop eating.
Right.
You can stop taking drugs and you can stop drinking, but
Well, yeah, answer that one, huh?
And that's actually one reason why, at least personally, I've wanted to focus on eating behavior, because it's more complicated in an interesting way where you can't just stop it altogether.
You can't do without drinking either, and if you don't have fluids, you're dead.
well, I know, but
Yeah.
alcohol.
Breathing.
No, it's true, and like I was saying before, you know, we should have never come to this point where we need self-control for food. We should just enjoy food and enjoy it in natural, kind of unprocessed ways. But yeah.
What do you mean by should? You never should have come.
Where's the teacher?
But I'm asking, you're saying, like, we're at a point where we have to, like, exhibit self-control, and you say we shouldn't be there. Is that because food should be so scarce that we should?
No. I think it's just the way, like I said, and this would be interesting to trace too, just the Industrial Revolution and how things are distributed, and just these large corporations, you know, controlling a lot of the stuff, and I'm saddened by that trajectory. I mean, yeah, it's made things convenient, and I can go to the grocery store and get like whatever I want. So like the American dream is there for me, but is that really the dream I want to follow? The dream that's best for us in terms of, you know, the race, yeah.
A little off subject, and I missed the beginning, so I didn't talk about what is the urge to eat out of boredom?
Oh, why is
Like
that?
you're not hungry, there's nothing, like what is it in your brain that's telling you, like, I don't know, I have nothing to do, I'm just trying to eat something.
Yeah, so.
Why? Is it a reward? Is it like, I don't know.
Yeah,
For me, it's automatic. I don't even realize I ate it.
You're
No.
on autopilot.
No, but I mean, that will arise.
You're bored.
Again, it's like the availability, like what food do you have at home that you kind of know subconsciously is there for you. And I mean, out of boredom, I mean, I wish like that should be more studied. Or,
Like I eat a lot of boredom.
No, and
Everything
but-
else to do, I'm gonna eat something.
right. I mean, sometimes it's just the thing to do, but otherwise it is just based on that external cue, and you know, it's so easy to do. So like it requires the least amount of effort, you're more likely to
It's
do.
an easy habit,
Yeah.
you know. And it's a habit that we perpetuate by repetition.
Right. And we all have to eat, so it's like all this comes together.
We can justify it.
Yeah.
Do you have any research that supports the idea that there might be a relationship between any nutrient deficiency and the behavior of overeating or something similar to that?
Yeah. Well.
This comes from an idea that I thought of. If the body is actually deprived of one or more nutrients, there might be an evolutionary advantage to keep eating until the need for that nutrient is satisfied.
Well, yeah, that's a good point, because the issue we have right now is that foods are so stacked with calories, carbohydrates, sugar, that's not meeting our other nutrient needs. So then the question is, how do we get that? But the studies in our lab and others, you know, we've shown different types of food images, and unless you're like strangely attracted to kale, like raw kale, and maybe you can get, like, your ventral striatum is not going to activate to raw kale, like for 98% of people. But if I show you, like, you know, a delicious cake or a cheeseburger, or I mean, just because think of it this way. We've inherited this equipment that was effective for a more foraging type of context. So that and whatever signals we have that's like, oh, this is energy rich. So you want to seek this out because our ancestors needed that to survive.
But our ancestors also had nutrient-rich food,
Right.
which we tend not to have.
Right, so maybe if I got into a DeLorean, went back in time, and I scanned them, maybe they like their reward system was differently tuned up. Maybe it would be like equally kind of sensitive or active to all of these things. Whereas now we've skewed and kind of pushed the system in just this very kind of limited space of these highly processed, caloric rich foods.
And some of those foods, let's be honest, they're engineered to be addictive.
Right.
The preservatives and
Yes.
the chemicals that are added are put there. I mean,
Yes.
read the back
Yeah.
of a bag of Doritos sometimes. It's scary. There's MSG in there. Isn't MSG bad for us? Wasn't there a big thing about Chinese food? Don't eat it because of the MSG? Well, they took it out and they put it in the Doritos. They did. It's kind of frightening. If you read the ingredients and try to keep to 10 or less,
Right.
those potato chips are not going to be as exciting as the Cool Ranch Doritos.
Are the Cape Cod chips okay? Because I love those. Like, can we keep eating those? Is that okay?
Read the back. Read the back. Ingredients are less. It should be fine.
You
Most of those
start
are.
by just eating a few.
Yeah.
We have a question back.
Well, just a couple of quick comments. I had seen a summary of a report that talked about if babies are shown a smorgasbord of food, they'll eat a good diet until you allow them to have sugar, and that completely destroys it. And the last thing is, I wanted to thank you for your presentation and to mention that this isn't really where the big money is in research on this kind of stuff. The big money in research of this kind of stuff is done by Procter & Gamble, Nestle.
Yes, absolutely.
They know what we want probably better than we do. So
That's the cycle I want to break.
if you approach it that if it's advertised, there must be something wrong with it. That's where I'm at this point in time.
No, thank you for that. And actually, there's a wonderful book that kind of gives you an inside window into the research done at these companies. And the research is impressive. It's impressive, the extent of it, how detailed, how comprehensive. There's a book called Salt, Sugar, Fat by Michael Moss. And he kind of does these profiles of these different companies. And it's funny because I've read parts of it, and part of me is like, that's really interesting that they did this research. I'm like, wait, but then they're using it in this way. So again, with great power comes great responsibility. But that's, that was good. That's a good comment. What time is it? I've lost track of time altogether.
It's 10 till 7.
So you have to come back.
Thanks for coming.
We have to take Mama to dinner.